Hello again, YouTube. Welcome back. So, I've begun development on episode 2, the next major update of Redeemart, so it'll have the next quarter of the story in it. And I thought it would be interesting for today's devlog to go through and take a look at how I make a level in Redeemart. This one's a good one because it's all about assembling the next weapon in the game. So, let's check it out. Alrighty. So the first step, anytime I'm adding content to the game, is I always go back to my script to see what I'm going to be adding. I have another document, which is more like an Excel sheet that just breaks down what's going to happen during each section of the game. The script itself is all of the dialogue that's going to take place. So I start out by doing a read-through, so I have an idea of what's going to happen in each section of the game. And I also always do a pass to try and find spelling mistakes or just things I want to change. In this first level of Chapter 2, a couple things happen. For this video, we're going to focus in on the pre-wave, which is the section before the combat begins. And in this level, we assemble the next weapon in the game, the Grill Sploder. So that's what we're going to focus in on today. When it comes to these revisions, there's things like spelling and grammar that I'll update, but a lot of times it's more so just having another pass through, having an idea of what each character should sound like, or any opportunity I have to tie it back into the convenience store. So for instance, during the story section of this level, it's really focused on Isaac, and Isaac is the store owner, so I always have him saying lots of things related to the Redeemart store. So you can see here I highlighted this one section. I wanted to have a metaphor of biting into a chocolate bar in the store. So I opened up the game and found a good bar to use. I went with Mancha Munch. Once I'm happy with the script, it's time to bring the dialogue over to the game engine. This is a bit of an arduous process. This is one of those things where I decided to go with the kind of dumber solution of lots of copy and pasting and editing of text files rather than I could write a nice script that would kind of bring this in for me. So I go through and I copy and paste from my document into my subtitles Lua file. And as I add each line of dialogue to the subtitles Lua file, there's a couple things that need to be set. So it needs to have a unique name. I just have this numbered naming convention, so I just go through and make sure I iterate. It needs to have the text that's actually going to appear, and then it needs to be associated with one of the characters in the store. So this is just a lot of dumb manual work as I copy and paste and edit these files, but once I'm done here, the game will have access to all of these subtitles. Part of the reason why I have this slightly obtuse solution is if one day I wanted to translate the game into another language, I can have a different language subtitle file, and as long as I'm still using the same unique IDs, the same names for each subtitle, they could be associated with a different language, and swapping in that text would be super easy. Okay, so all of the dialogue is in for the pre-wave section, so before the monster attacks. This is where most of the work is going to have to be done to implement this level. So once all of those subtitles are in, now I can start calling them in the scripting. So I go through in my Lua file and I script this level, which is going to call all the dialogue. It's going to say it's time to start assembling a weapon. It's going to trigger all of the gameplay sequencing. Once that sequencing is set up, I load it up in the game and I test to see if it's matching with the dialogue I've written. There's a couple reasons I do this, just to safety check to make sure I haven't missed anything or made any spelling mistakes. As well, something that I have to watch out for is writing in a Google Doc, you use rich text, whereas in my game I'm just using ASCII. So things like quotation marks or a triple period, those are all characters that are available in rich text that aren't available in ASCII, so I have to go through and cut all of those out and make sure it all gets updated properly. So this is just kind of a sanity check to make sure that I've properly brought in the dialogue. Here I just go back and forth comparing the two. Another thing that I run into sometimes is sometimes I have a line of dialogue be too long. It kind of overruns in the speech bubble, so I'll go and I'll split it up into multiple lines as well. With the dialogue set up, I wanted to set up the scripting around assembling the second weapon in the game. So I script all of the calls in my Lua file, get it to a point where I think it should be working properly, and I test it out. You can see right now all of the items that you're going to need to assemble the second weapon all appear at once. So I wanted to modify that and make it so as they're being listed out in the dialogue, they appear on screen with each one. While I was jumping back and forth, I also noticed I have dialogue in there where I want a drum roll before the new weapon is announced. So I have a drum roll sound effect I scripted to be played. From there, I got to work on the C++ side. So I was happy with my Lua scripting, and the Lua scripting tells the C++ code when to execute specific functions. So right now, I'm adding this challenge or this objective of assembling this weapon, and I have that challenge or that objective defined as grabbing everything, and it has all of the items you're going to need. So I go through in here and I update it so it starts with just the first item you're going to need, and then there'll be additional Lua calls that I'll update and add each item as it's said in the dialogue. And now I test it out, and I can see each item is being added the way I'd like it to be. The next issue I run into is the items are being added properly and the objectives are clear, but when I select an item that I should be able to purchase to assemble the weapon, I can't buy it. So I have to go back to the C++ code and figure out what's going wrong. So I have some logic in the game where every time you go to buy an item, it'll check to see if you should be able to purchase this. And this is just to prevent so people just don't go around the store buying every single thing. So I had to add in some logic to say the second weapon assembly is beginning, and here are the items you can purchase. I also had a little bit of a bug around, I had a if around what chapter it currently is, and introducing that seemed to cause some issues. I added a bool just for when it's time to buy the launcher items. So I added that to my game state class. I actually went through and I took a bunch of bools I had like that and I made a new struct to try and clean things up a little bit. Currently, it's a pretty huge mess. During the development, it got pretty unwieldy. So now's probably the time to start cleaning things up. And then in my check to see if you should be able to buy something, I added in that launcher bool. And if it is true, so if we're in the state of assembling the launcher, I have this long list of all of the items that should be acceptable to purchase, so I updated that to match the items you're going to need. From there, I double-checked I could purchase all the items. It looks like I missed the milk cartons the first time through, so I had to go back. And the other thing I noticed was the baseball bat. It looked like the texture was actually reversed, so I made a note that I'm going to have to go back and fix that. Once I could buy everything, I realized it wasn't properly triggering. Now it was time to assemble all of the items, so I had to add that in. So when you've collected all of the items you need, now go over to the corner where you assemble weapons, and it's time to assemble. Of course, once I had that working, I realized you can go to assemble, and none of the models are appearing. As you can see, this is kind of a continued pattern of I kept thinking all this stuff was just going to start working, no problem, and each step there was something to do. Fortunately, this was actually a pretty easy fix. I have a file that defines all of the map data I should load, and I just commented out the models that we use in assembling the second weapon, just because when I release the game, right now, the second weapon isn't in the game, so it's not necessary. So I just removed that comment, and now it'll start loading that. Once I did that, I found I was missing an image texture for one of the models. I had it as a PNG, I just had to go and update it as a DDS. Next video, we're going to talk more about textures and can kind of dig into what's going on in my engine behind the scenes. But yeah, I just needed to update that. And with that, I could finally start doing the assembly sequence. However, I did notice some problems immediately. I had set it up so you just press the A button through most of these. So I wanted to go through and switch up the buttons just for interest, but also just to try and relate better for what you're doing on screen. As well, there's a lot of scripted camera movement here, and you can see it's pretty janky right now, and it's really not well scripted. you're kind of looking in weird directions. You can see the floor mat at the door is, it's called Z fighting. So it's at the same depth as the floor, and the two of them are fighting against each other, so I have to move that. And the other thing I noticed was it's really obvious that there's no ceiling in the game right now, so I figured I should make one so it's not quite as glaring. And I think the last thing I noticed, there was quite a few things I had to update here, was I needed some sound effects, because I have sound effects for the first assembly, gotta have them for the next one. Before I start digging into the assembly sequence, there was one more thing I wanted to do with purchasing the items. In the game, I have a system where there are, I call them pointers, which is kind of a bad name with all the programming going on in this channel, but I have a marker that'll show up on screen, which will show you where to go to next if you don't know where to go. So you can, in the game, you can set your control options where every time you need to do something in the store, it'll point out where to go, or you can set it so there's a button you'll press, and when you press it, it'll appear. So to go along with this system, I had to set it up and give it the info, so when you're assembling the second gun, there are associated pointers with all of the objects you're going to be looking for. So just a location where every time you go to find the barbecue, the big pointy arrow appears in the right spot above the barbecue, so it's in the right spot to point the user where to go next. The process of doing this is pretty straightforward. I just look at what each item is going to be, then I look at where that aisle is on the map, I get that location, that 3D position, and I add that to my file of where to place the arrow. So I did a test of my arrows and they were guiding pretty well. I think there was one or two I had to kind of go back and forth on, but otherwise I was fairly happy with them. And I started messing around with the floor mat. I really just had to get the right object and just set its Z value a little higher, but I kept adjusting the wrong one. So you'll see me a couple times mess around with this. Eventually I get it by the end, but I just needed to offset that a little bit. So I lied before I got into the assembly sequence. I actually wanted to fix the bat. So I just opened up the model and I messed around with it a little bit. I needed to mirror the UVs to make sure that the texture wasn't displaying backwards. And when I did that, I actually messed up the normals, so you could see inside the bat, and I messed up the scale. So I had a couple times of having to go back and forth, but eventually I got it right. So it looks just like how it did before the change, but now the texture is set up properly. Next up was the ceiling. Admittedly, it has been quite a while since I've done some Blender work. I was actually kind of happy to do some 3D modeling, but I definitely have gotten rusty. It's definitely one of those things where if you don't have the key bindings in your mind, if you haven't done them for a while, that muscle memory starts to fade. But I gave it my best effort. Took a couple tries. I did some dumb things the first time and had to kind of work through it. And I definitely was not very efficient. Definitely there are much faster ways to do it, but I got it all going. I wanted to have a drop ceiling, just like ceiling tiles for the top. And I wasn't really going to display it very often just because most of the game has that top-down view, so the model was actually not even going to be drawing. It's just when you're looking at the shelves or when you're assembling an item that you would be able to see it. So I made a drop ceiling. I had some light panels in there. I tried to emulate that. I gave them emissive sections so that it should, in the engine, make those look a little bit like they're glowing. And overall, I think it was pretty good. It was not really the highest quality art pass, but I think it looks pretty good and it definitely doesn't stand out. It's admittedly something I've really been meaning to do for quite a while, is put a roof on this game. So before I tested it out, I actually added some code. I think if I just had the model constantly showing, it shouldn't be a problem. Because I checked to see which direction objects are facing when I go to render them, it should be just ignored when you do the top-down view. But instead of having to do that check and having the cost of starting it in the graphics pipeline, I added logic so the ceiling isn't displaying most of the time. It's just when you enter what I've called like the first-person perspective that the ceiling is enabled for graphics. And now you can see the stunning results. The immersion is complete now that there's a ceiling. It's It's like you're in the store, you can smell a convenience store cleaning products right in front of you. From here I got to work on the assembly sequence. One of the things I wanted to change was the button prompts on screen. There's a point where you hold forward with both sticks and you wrap duct tape around the launcher. And my UI items showed these arrows that would start at the center and lift up. And it kind of looked like you would push forward and release, whereas really you should just be holding forward. So I wanted to update the code so it would just display with the arrow stationary forward. So that was one of the first things I did. After that, I got to work on remapping the button presses. So for instance, at the start here, right now you press A and the legs get removed from the barbecue. I replaced those with the triggers just because I felt like you press the left trigger and the left leg disappears, you press the right trigger and the right leg disappears. I just thought there was a bit more logic there. Just trying to vary up what buttons you press to make it a bit more engaging, and as much as possible have it relate to what's happening in the game. This continued with most of the button presses. I tried to eliminate as many repetitive A presses as possible and tried to vary it up. Another issue I ran into was the assembly sequence wasn't ending properly. So at the end of the assembly, the camera seemed to break in this weird first-person perspective. So I had to work on making sure that gets set up properly as well. Here you can see that update with the arrows. I know it doesn't look like much, but just before they were starting in the center and moving forward and then resetting, it kind of showed like you were going to be moving the sticks up and down, where now it's just hold forward. Okay, so I was pretty happy with the changed button presses. To be honest with you, I was a little afraid of doing the camera changes just because I didn't know how involved they would be. And it's really a pain the way I've set things up. You have to go over to that spot in the store, start the sequence, go through pressing the buttons, and then you find, oh, did I change things properly or not? So I was a little afraid of opening up that can of worms. So instead of doing that, the next thing I did was I started working on a tutorial screen, which would show the player how you use this launcher weapon, because it is different in its controls. And the way I go about this is I have a Photoshop template I use, and I just set up the text and try and give a good, reasonable explanation. I add the buttons you're going to be pressing, and once I'm happy with how that image looks, I'll export it. And then in the game engine, I'll start to try and define that in data. So to do that, I just copy over the text into my Lua files, and I define which buttons are going to appear on the screen. And this is pretty ugly, it's a bit of a waste of time, but I have that image that I've made and I've exported and I draw it on screen. And then I go over and I move the positions on the text and the buttons and just try to make it match up as best as I can. One of the things that is cool with my system that I've made is these images you're seeing on screen for the buttons you press. They're all Xbox One themed. That's because I have an Xbox One controller plugged in. Those will all dynamically update to whatever control scheme you're using. So that was something that was important to me, was I didn't want to have just a whole bunch of images of the same tutorial and just have to toggle which one gets displayed based on the controller. By doing it this way, you can change the text later, and by doing it this way, you get dynamic button prompts. Once I was happy with the tutorial, and still avoiding the camera movement, it was time to start working on the HUD elements. The only thing I really had to change here was I was happy with how it looks. You can see it here. Just the only thing I had to change was I had it written as launcher rather than the grill sploder. So I had to update the UI to match and just say grill sploder instead of launcher. The last thing I had to do before finally addressing the camera issues was I needed some sound effects. Both I wanted to record some new ones, custom for the launcher, and I just had to make sure that I was calling sound effects as you're assembling the weapon. I really felt like with the first weapon, this added a lot of making it kind of a more immersive experience. I know I say that jokingly, but truly, as you're pressing buttons, you're getting audio-visual responses. So I busted out my camera and I started recording some sound effects. The first thing I recorded was I had written in my dialogue when it explains that you have to pick up some car jumper cables, I wrote in it would be nice to have kind of a snap snap sound. So I got some pliers and I tried to record those. After that, I started trying to get some good cardboard sound effects. The milk cartons in the game get kind of crumpled up as you assemble the weapon, so I thought maybe I could get some good noises with this. I went in and I exported my plier sound effect and I set it up so in the game, after you're told you need to get a pair of jumper cables, that little t-t-t sound effect plays. Then I just opened up these recordings I've been using for this video, and I would just play a little bit, see the actions happen visually, and try and pick a good sound effect. Some of them I reused from previous recordings I had, and a bunch I added from what I grabbed from these recordings. And this process is pretty straightforward. You just go through, and every time the user presses a button or does an action, I wanted to have a sound effect associated with it. So I just go back and forth between them all until eventually everything on screen has a sound effect. Once the sound effects were in and starting to look good, I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to get to the camera. This ended up actually not being anywhere near as bad as I thought it would be. I was able to get it in just a couple passes, just adjusting some values, and I added a couple extra kind of steps to make things a little bit easier, to make sure you don't ever clip through anything with the camera. But it ended up actually not being too bad. Okay, so I did not expect to hit that many snags. I thought that would be smooth sailing, but that's okay. It gives you a peek behind the curtain. You get to see how it works making a level in Redeemart. There's still more stuff I had to do behind the scenes. Obviously, I did the other sections of the level that I didn't show, and I did some more polishing, and I still have more work to be done in general. I'm glad I'm still in early access, because things like doing the assembly, I know the frame rate takes a big hit, and there's some graphical things I'd like to improve, but we'll get there in time. That being said, let's take a look at the final assembly sequence with the sound effects and all of the updates in place, and I'll be out. So be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and thanks so much. Check it out.